For today's episode of Newscast, we're joined by our colleague in Washington, D.C. It's Caitríona Perry, who's the chief news anchor there in D.C. Hello, Caitríona.
Hi, Adam. How are you?
Very well, thank you. And all this week on Newscast, I've set newscasters the task of educating me about other places in the world that have multiple names. And that is because the Gulf of America is the new name that Donald Trump wants us to use for the Gulf of Mexico. And so we've got some examples here. Richard emailed to say, for a long time, the North Sea was known as the German Ocean on continental maps. I'm not sure when the name settled down, probably at the end of one of the wars. Did you know that, James, as diplomatic correspondent?
I did know that it was because there's still the German Bight, which is the lower bit of it.
Bight spelt B-I-G-H-T.
Correct.
B-I-T.
But yes, but if you remember also thinking in the North Sea, is there was a long time, there was quite a dispute when on the weather charts, they referred to that bit of part of the shipping forecast was Fitzroy, and then which previously Finisterre. And there was quite a row when Finisterre was changed to Fitzroy because a lot of the traditionalists thought it was outrageous and it shouldn't be changed.
I knew you'd have a lot to say on this. Someone just told me that you would. And Caitríona, this week, I mean, look, people in Congress got involved in the whole renaming thing as well, didn't they? Particularly, there's one example around about Greenland.
That's it. Earl Buddy Carter, a Republican congressman from Georgia, he introduced a bill a couple of days ago called the Red, White and Blue Land Bill, authorising President Trump to buy Greenland and call it Red, White and Blue Land. I've also seen a petition from Denmark, tongue-in-cheek, to buy California and call that New Denmark. So there's land grabbing going on all over the place, it feels like.
The key point, obviously, with Greenland...
Professor Landale's got another point.
No, this is just sort of the irony is, of course, that it's not green, right? But it was called Greenland by some mad Viking type called Eric, deliberately to attract settlers from Northern Europe to come and live there. And so if they were told it's Greenland, they would think it's probably a nice place to go and lush and green.
And then you turn up and it's a bit chilly.
Actually, it's a little bit chillier than that.
Okay. And Chris, I'm just guessing with your lost voice, you're just like a throat sweetie of any name.
Absolutely right. Any brand, any name. We can have an argument about the name as long as it's soothing and a lozenge. That is fine by me.
All right. Well, let's see how soothed you are by the end of this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And Croaky Chris here too.
And slightly less croaky, James is here in the studio as well.
And not at all croaky, Caitríona in the studio in Washington.
Right. We're recording this episode of Newscast kind of early evening on Thursday. And Chris, we were just saying, these days when you record a podcast that people listen to at different times, it's quite important to say when you're recording it because the news is moving at like quite a ferocious pace.
Yeah, so we're used to, aren't we? 2025 is the time-shifting era and podcasts are zeitgeisty and you can listen to stuff after they're recorded. Maybe not in the second term of Donald Trump. Maybe the rolling return of exclusively live news is the future, with the grave danger that anything committed to tape and listened to even a nanosecond later is wildly out of date.
Yeah. So, James, this is your opportunity to kind of just zoom back a bit and just be a bit magisterial about what we think has happened in the last 24 hours with Trump and Putin speaking on the phone about Ukraine, without Ukraine, and then the quite strong reaction that has provoked from people all across the world, basically.
Well, this is the moment we all expected would happen at some point, and it's now happened, namely that President Trump has actually had a conversation with President Putin about the future of Ukraine. So that was always something that was going to happen. If you think about it, for many weeks we've been talking about what Mr. Trump has been saying about Gaza and other parts of the Middle East. Now we've moved on to the other major conflict in the world. And what has surprised people, I think, is a little bit of the content, because he has set out, with the help of his defence secretary, quite a lot of positions that a lot of people in Europe have sort of said, why are you giving away so many concessions? So he's talked...
Things that Putin wanted.
Yeah, in other words, NATO membership will not be part of any kind of peace deal. They're not going to get much territory back. If you remember, this guy was supposed to be a pariah, but now he's given 90 minutes on the phone directly with the president.
And potentially even a visit to Moscow by the president.
A visit. And not only that, but also exclusive US-Russia talks. So all of that is quite a good position for Mr. Putin to win on day one of what's going to be a very long process. So there's that's unusual about it. And then secondly, I think just the fact of it, the way it's come out, has left a lot of the Europeans scratching their heads slightly, because behind it all is a broader point, which is that the US are signalling a further withdrawal from commitment to European security. There is a difference, I think, between the Americans saying, in a way that many people think is correct, that the Europeans should be spending more on their defence.
Yeah, which was the previous conversation.
That's an argument that the Americans have been having for many years, and has become quite acute in recent years. There's that, but then there is also the US administration saying we are going to step back, because essentially their message is we will sort this ceasefire deal, and then we will leave you Europeans to make it happen, to ensure it works itself. There are so many questions built into that, but that's why it's ruffled feathers and has been quite startling.
Caitríona, loads of things to pick up with you there. First of all, is this another example of Donald Trump saying something quite bold, but his actual real intentions, I won't use the word subtler, but are not exactly what his initial position is? Is there something else going on here that's kind of deeper?
Potentially, I think there's a commercial element to this as well. It was quite interesting this week when we saw so many of Donald Trump's team, if you like, out in the wild. The Defence Secretary, Pete Hegseth, the Vice President, J.D. Vance, his various special envoys, Keith Kellogg and Steve Witkoff. But we also saw the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, in Ukraine, having talks on a commercial basis. Treasury Secretaries aren't usually involved in peace deals unless it's to do with sanctions and so on. But we've heard Donald Trump talk about these rare earth minerals that exist in Ukraine. So I think he's kind of zoned in on there could be something tremendously beneficial to the United States in this. And yes, he's kind of flying the balloon really high and see where it comes back down. But it's very different to what he laid out last week around Gaza, which, you know, was just so far from the realms of what can actually happen. This is more realistic. He's got his big team out there, and he's gone over the heads not only of the Ukrainian president, but as James was saying there, of the EU, and they're really angry about it. But you have President Trump and President Putin having that big long conversation before speaking to President Zelensky, Moscow saying that that call was actually initiated by President Trump. And I think what we've seen with everything that President Trump has done since he's come into office is it's very strategic. He barnstormed the domestic agenda in the first 10 days. He's barnstorming his foreign policy agenda in these kind of second 10 days to 2 weeks.
And James, it looks as if European leaders were caught out by this, even though if you've been paying attention, you knew something like this was going to happen. Maybe not the exact details. Trump went further than a lot of people were expecting. But the whole thing, the whole shebang seems to have come as a surprise to lots of EU leaders and EU defence ministers.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's quite surprising, because it shouldn't. You know, you know, the one thing, well, maybe there are other things, but one thing that Donald Trump has in common with Vladimir Putin is they're quite open about setting out their intentions. If you actually listen and watch and read what they say, actually there's a lot of it sort of spelt out. I think what surprised them is the manner that he's gone about it. I think they felt that they would be consulted, they would be at the table. Because if you think about it, you know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, you know, this thing might have been done under the auspices of the United Nations or somebody else. There would be talks, there'd be meetings, there'd be pre-talks. There'd be Sherpas, and things like that. Well, that hasn't happened, because, in other words, what we've seen in the last 24 hours, I think, is to my mind, the best illustration of the fact that the international rules-based order is much diminished, because the international order is not being used to sort this out. Essentially, it is powerful men just trying to decide the fate of weaker nations. And I include in those weaker nations, you know, not just Ukraine, but also the Europeans. Essentially, Donald Trump is saying, I am going to talk to the other European superpower, Russia, quote unquote, and we're going to sort out a deal.
And that deal may involve your other countries providing troops and boots on the ground to police any deal.
And what was even amazing is that Peter Hegseth, the Defence Secretary, the US Defence Secretary, having made those astonishing sort of, you know, concessions in terms of NATO membership and territorial loss today, added to this today by suggesting that US military and financial support to Ukraine was on the table to be used as part of the negotiations. And then he went even further, suggesting that US conventional troop numbers in Europe as part of NATO could also be part of the ultimate negotiation. So in other words, something which has got absolutely nothing to do with Ukraine directly, but at a point. So let's just have a weird scenario here. Say there is some kind of peace settlement. Say there is some kind of European troop deployment to Ukraine to ensure its security in the long term without US support. Suddenly you have US troops leaving Poland and other parts of Europe, leaving that bit of Eastern Europe even more vulnerable to Russian attack. Well, you know what happens if the Finnish troops are told you've got to go to Ukraine, but leaving Finland's border open, or the Baltics, and the same thing. So there are all of these things here now, which a lot's going to be unstitched as a result of this.
I mean, mind blown by what you just said there, James. But Caitríona, just is there any sense from the people that you talk to in the administration about process-wise how this might work? Are we talking about a big summit between Trump and Putin and the negotiating teams where they are sort of stood there drawing lines on a map? Or are we talking about a year-long thing that there's meetings in all sorts of places with all sorts of people and it's not actually as dramatic as it might sound?
They're talking about it from the more dramatic perspective, and I will say that a lot of this tends to rest solely with President Trump. It doesn't filter down through to the rest of his team immediately, but they're definitely looking at having that initial summit anyway as soon as they can possibly make it happen. Obviously, we heard President Trump talk about meeting in Saudi Arabia, and the potential deadline for that might even be as soon as the end of February. So they're looking to make something happen very, very soon.
Chris, let's talk about the UK angle now. Yeah. And the UK does seem slightly like bystanders in all of this when you consider that under the Boris Johnson era, like Britain was sort of first among equals when it came to talking about Ukraine. Let's listen to Keir Starmer reacting to the various shenanigans of the last 24 hours.
Nobody wants the conflict to continue, and Ukrainians, more than anybody, want the conflict to end. But we must make sure that Ukraine is at the heart of this. And there can't be any negotiations about Ukraine without Ukraine being at the heart of it. And it's really important that Ukraine is in the strongest possible position, whether that's in discussions or whether it's continued fighting, which is why I've been arguing since I've been Prime Minister that we need to ramp up the money, the capability and the training that we're putting into Ukraine. And we're delivering even more of that this year than we were last year. It's really important, strongest possible position for Ukraine. But this has to be done with Ukraine. And that's the discussion I had with President Zelensky when I was over there just 2 or 3 weeks ago.
And Chris, that's the big difference between Trump and Starmer, isn't it? Trump is like, oh, let's end this, give up territory, can't join NATO. Starmer is saying Ukraine has to be in the strongest position possible, which means more and continued help from its allies.
Yeah, it's so interesting unpacking every single sentence of what we heard there from the Prime Minister. So Keir Starmer was out there in Kyiv just before the inauguration. That timing was intentional. There was an awareness that there was going to be this gap that was likely to emerge between Washington and London. We've seen Keir Starmer over the last couple of weeks desperately try and ride both horses between the EU and the US. He's likely to be out in Washington to see the president in the next couple of weeks. And we've seen him on other issues hug pretty close to the Washington line. So not signing that AI declaration in Paris the other day, which America also didn't sign.
Which would have been a big diplomatic snub to President Macron.
Yeah, he met the Prime Minister the other day in Downing Street, his Danish opposite number, to return to the conversation about Greenland. Was there a news conference? No, there wasn't. Had there been, what would have been the question? Whose side are you on? News conference avoided, question and answer avoided. But on this, there is that difference emphasised by that point about ensuring that Ukraine is in the strongest possible place and that Ukraine is part of the conversation. So you already see, and we're going to see it obviously flesh out in the coming weeks on all sorts of topics, not least this one, a definite difference of instinct between the UK and Washington on how this proceeds.
and have a listen to who was back on Frontline Politics today. It was the previous Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who was asking a question to a minister in the House of Commons today, and they were talking about Ukraine. And here's what the previous Prime Minister said.
Can I ask the Minister if she agrees with me that in this new world and in the event of any peace deal, that the United Kingdom and its European allies must lead in providing Ukraine with military support and potentially military presence across land, air and sea to give Ukraine confidence that any peace will endure? And can I assure the government that it will have my support if that's what it decides to do?
We aim to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position to enable it to negotiate, and that involves continuing to supply them with the arms and weapons that they need in order to fight, because fighting is still going on in a very fierce manner in that country. So we need to step up and make sure we do that.
And that was the Defence Minister, Maria Eagle, answering Rishi Sunak's question. Chris, what did you think about Rishi Sunak's reappearance?
It's interesting seeing how he has kind of calibrated occasional reappearances. But I think hearing him underlines, I think, a point we've made on Newscast before, but I think is worth making again in this context, that we've had, haven't we, 4 or 5 years of spectacular turbulence in British politics. 4 prime ministers in the blink of an eye, a change of party of government, and yet a consistency about the policy towards what's going on in Ukraine, to such an extent that a matter of months ago, I think prior to the Republican convention, you had Boris Johnson going to see then candidate Trump, which in conventional terms might seem awkward to a new Labour Prime Minister, but who was making an argument that was in keeping with existing British foreign policy, even though the government had changed.
But that might change, and I say might, if pressure on defence spending rises. So as a result of whatever happens in Ukraine, if that requires substantial deployment of British forces to Ukraine, if it demands greater defence spending by the UK and others, then there is the potential for there to be a tension, not just in government between the Treasury and Downing Street over where the money should be spent or not, but actually between the population. And I think that's an interesting debate that we have not yet had in this country.
I agree about, yeah.
And I'm just speculating here, but will a time come where there are people in the UK who say, hang on a minute, should we be spending that sort of money on defence when we should be spending money on schools and hospitals? Because the point is, that argument has been ignored by successive governments. And there are many people in my world who just say, we have to spend more on defence. This is not about Donald Trump. This is a reality, and no government has grasped that. But it's possible that argument might be forced on this government in the months to come.
I was just thinking that listening to the Rishi Sunak clip there, just what's that old, James, you will know this, that phrase about decades can happen in weeks and weeks can happen in decades.
No, it's
Lenin.
No, it's decades can happen in a week, and there's a precise phrase.
But if you think about where we were 6 months ago, a year ago, the idea of a former prime minister or a prime minister talking about A, the war ending, and B, the way it ending by being British personnel on the ground in Ukraine, kind of policing some kind of ceasefire, which is sort of the subtext of what Rishi Sunak was getting at there.
But I think, let's be clear here. We're talking a long way in the future here. We're not talking about European troops in any way engaging in war fighting or joining war. They would simply be there to ensure Ukraine's security in a deterrent effect in the future.
Oh, yeah, no, I wasn't suggesting that they're going in now, but I just mean in terms of that conversation, a frontline senior politician saying that a year ago would have been another mind-blowing moment. But now it's just become part of the conversation we're having today on Thursday.
Quick Lenin update.
Has he texted in? What's to Newscast?
Absolutely right. There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen.
And it was Lenin.
It was.
Yeah.
Thanks for getting in touch, Lenin's ghost. 0330-123-9480 for any other spirits that want to get into. I mean, I'd love to know what Churchill thinks about all of this. Caitríona.
Or there are decades in a day in Washington.
Yeah, exactly. Look who we're talking to. I'm just intrigued about how this all plays out in the States, because is there politics around this in the States? Do any American voters even really care about this? And actually, Trump is behaving in a really rational domestic way, because to most Americans, it feels like a long way away, and they're not even bothered.
Yeah, and it's interesting, James, when you're talking about a conversation in Britain around, spending money on British taxpayers versus people in a different country. That's the conversation that dominated a large part of the election campaign here and years previously about why is the US spending money. We remember the big hold up in Congress last year about the extra funding for Ukraine, the extra aid to Ukraine. And, when grocery prices are so high here, there's almost little to no welfare here, that people are saying, why do we send this money abroad? Why do we put our men and women in uniform in the line of fire, in danger for other faraway countries on the other side of the globe when we have so much need in our own country? In everything that Donald Trump says, in fact, in his inaugural address as well, in the rotunda in the Capitol, he made that same point of wanting to kind of pull back, defending American borders, not defending borders in other countries. So there is broad support for that among the population, whether they are Republicans or Democrats or independent voters who do want a better focus put on the American people and services here, healthcare, education, all of that kind of thing. And we have seen that happen. So when President Trump speaks and tries to do a deal here, as he puts it, and presents it in a way of it's a win for the American public, there is support for that.
The irony, of course, with that is that most of America's aid to Ukraine is spent in the United States through American arms manufacturers. So it helps the US. And also the argument is that it's very, very cost effective American security, because for very little money, it's basically been damaging its main strategic opponent in Europe, i.e. Russia, using somebody else's ground forces. So so there's a debate to be had there. But at the moment, as Caitríona said, politically, there will be, as we've seen in the States, and we'll probably see here, there'll be just straightforward, should we be spending this money? Because the counter argument is, look, if you don't spend this money now, then you're going to have to spend even more money in the future if Russia invaded, Estonia. Or something like that.
Yeah. So bar a Russian invasion of Estonia, what are some things we should look out for the next few days, James, that might tell us where this whole situation is going? I mean, I'm very conscious everyone's meeting in Munich for this Munich security conference where all the diplomacy and defence bigwigs go and have a chat, but also there is business gets done there.
Yeah, look, Munich over the next few days will be very important, simply because this is where the Europeans and the Americans sort of come face to face. It's the big sort of annual security jamboree. The Americans sent a very large delegation. It's not just sort of, US leaders. It's also US members of Congress go there. And so it's a sort of annual stock take of the state of the transatlantic alliance. And I think, the Vice President is there, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is there, the Defense Secretary, Peter Hegseth, will be there. Excuse me, I'm picking up Chris's cough. And I think that what we will see is perhaps a little bit more detail from the Americans, because at the moment, it's just a few statements from President Trump. And I think we will also see a greater European response to this, to say, look, how is this going to work? So I think there'll be an attempt by both sides to try and, I hope, maybe just try and coordinate a little bit more, bit more discussion. But you're right, this is not a decision-making summit. This is just a conference where people go and they make public statements and they have private conversations.
Yeah. So, Chris, totally different story. The UK economy.
Yes.
It did grow in the final quarter of 2024, but only just.
Yeah, it grew by a smidgen, which is better news if you're in the Treasury than the opposite.
What's the opposite of a smidgen? I suppose decreasing.
I suppose a negative smidgen.
A negative smidgen.
But the overall picture is just one of flatlining. The economy is laggard. It is lacklustre. It has been for ages. Actually, when you look at the Office for National Statistics numbers, real GDP per head, i.e. on average our own personal economy, as opposed to the sum total of everybody's, suggests a shrinkage, feeling poorer, both in the last quarter of last year and all of last year.
Because the population got bigger at a faster rate than the economy did.
Exactly that. It got bigger. Yeah, exactly that. So that's clearly a headache for the Chancellor, not least because the underlying mission of the government is to grow the economy. Now, look, the long-term trend has been one of it being flat for a very long time. In fact, you could even push back a trajectory as far as the financial crisis. and any incoming government is unlikely to suddenly magic and transition out of that in the space of 6+ months. But ultimately, if that is your mission, you're going to be measured against that mission. We're seeing a lot, aren't we, in the last few weeks, and we've talked about it on Newscast, of the government trying to pull all sorts of levers to say this is what we are attempting to do. But yeah, that remains the domestic backdrop that underlies everything, and therefore, crucially, forms part of that conversation about the priorities of where money is spent.
And Caitríona, talking about the American economy, explain to me why so many people on my various social medias have been posting pictures of them like dropping eggs from the fridge and then going, oh no, there goes my life savings. What is going on with the price of eggs?
#eggflation. Yeah, the price of eggs has just skyrocketed, basically up 15% in the month of January, up more than 50% over a year. So just to give you a point of reference, a dozen eggs at the moment is $5. So I guess about £4 sterling for 12 eggs. And that's basic eggs. That's not, your fancy free range organic, blah, blah, blah. The price goes way up for those. About €4.80, I guess, would be the conversion there. So yeah, dropping a couple of eggs is a lot of money. We've seen people not buying eggs. We've seen restaurants putting surcharges on eggs, and that's if you can find eggs to start with. There is a shortage of eggs. And President Trump and some of his supporters have been seeking to lay the blame for this at the feet of Joe Biden and the outgoing administration. But actually, it's because of bird flu, which has broken out here in the US. And there is great concern among public health officials that it could become the next pandemic here. Already tens of millions of chickens have been slaughtered. So no chickens, no eggs. And so that's what's causing the rising price of eggs. But, it's 5 times the rate of inflation is how much eggs are going up by. So you can have your avocado toast, but no poached eggs on top.
No, and soon people will they won't be able to afford an egg white omelette. They'll want the whole egg in their omelettes for the healthy people in California. I'm just thinking, though, back here in the UK, it's been a while since we've had a news story based on a single food item, isn't it?
Yes.
We've had some famous ones.
I'm wondering where this is leading.
Well, no, it's just a general brain. I'm just opening the floor for a bit of a brainstorm.
One point
amongst learned colleagues.
One point that is there's definitely a parallel. I was talking to some MPs the other day, and they were saying they were getting irritated about folk like us talking about, and indeed the government or indeed anyone else talking about economic growth, and saying, look, the message they hear when they're talking to their constituents, because that's kind of not normal language, is it? Is prices. And this is the parallel with the eggs thing. And ultimately affordability and feeling poorer. And just that sense. Now, of course, underlying that are those macroeconomic issues around a lack of economic growth. But yeah, prices, cost of living, feeling poorer is how that translates into ordinary language and people's day-to-day experience.
Eggs, obviously, John Prescott, big egg moment.
Edwina
Curry and salmonella. John Gummer and burgers.
Yeah.
There's a fair number of sort of food item stories out there.
David Cameron going to Greg's. Do you remember that? When he said when it was Pastygate. Last time he had a pasty, and he named a bakery that had closed many years before.
Oh. I thought you were about to mention another story involving David Cameron and food items, but I'm glad you didn't.
Anyway, on that note, I think we will draw proceedings to a close. Also, I've made myself really hungry for a sausage roll now, so I might pop out and get one. Caitríona, thank you very much for joining us across the Atlantic, which I think is still called that.
It is for now, yeah.
James, thanks to you too.
It's great to be here.
And Chris, you can go off and get your lemon and ginger or whatever you want to gargle with.
Good idea.
And thanks to you for watching this episode of Newscast. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Newscast from the BBC.